The rain on Thessaly IV smelled like iron and old wood, and Callum Dre had been breathing it for 11 years before he understood that it was the planet's way of remembering something it had lost. He told the story that way later, starting with the rain, starting with the smell because the committee wanted tactical data and sensor logs and fleet dispositions, and Callum had none of those things to give them. He had been a linguist. He had been standing in the wrong place, at the right time, holding the only tool that mattered, and the tool was not a weapon. It was a vocabulary of 900 words in a language that no living thing in the known galaxy was supposed to speak. But that came later. The rain came first. Callum sat in the linguistics annex of the TCS Ashenvale, a wedge-class destroyer running dark through the outer shell of the Morinthi corridor, and listened to the rain against the hull. Not real rain, sensor wash. The Ashenvale's passive arrays translated ambient electromagnetic noise into audio analogs, so the crew could monitor local conditions without staring at screens. And in this stretch of space, the ambient noise sounded exactly like rain hitting a tin roof during a summer storm on Thessaly IV, the colony world where Callum had spent his childhood. He knew it was coincidence. He knew the similarity was a trick of frequency distribution and his own pattern-seeking brain. But after 14 months aboard a warship that ran so dark it sometimes forgot to illuminate its own corridors, the sound was a kindness he did not refuse. He was 41 years old. He had spent 19 of those years as a field linguist for the Terran Diplomatic Corps, the branch of human government that most people forgot existed until it prevented a war, at which point they briefly remembered it and then forgot again. Callum had been the senior linguist on the Veshan Trade Compact. He had decoded the ceremonial register of the Cathori negotiation caste, a tonal system so dense that each syllable carried 4 simultaneous layers of meaning: semantic, social, historical, and emotional, and the wrong inflection on a single vowel could shift a trade agreement into a declaration of kinship debt. He had spent 3 years on the border of Garen space, learning to read the subharmonic rumble that Garen warlords used beneath their spoken words, a frequency band so low that humans needed augmented hearing to detect it, carrying the real content of any Garen negotiation, while the audible words served as polite theater. Languages were what Callum did, what Callum was. He had once told his ex-wife, during one of the arguments that had eventually ended their marriage, that he dreamed in grammatical structures, that his unconscious mind parsed the sounds of the world into syntax before it parsed them into meaning. She had said that explained a great deal about their relationship. The Ashenvale carried a crew of 112. Callum knew perhaps a dozen of them by name. He was not crew, he was a civilian specialist assigned to a military vessel under Fleet Protocol 19. The regulation that governed the embedding of subject matter experts on ships dispatched to investigate phenomena beyond the crew's area of competence. The crew treated him the way military personnel always treated civilian specialists, with a politeness that sat precisely 1 degree warmer than indifference. He ate in the officer's mess because his billet entitled him to it, and he sat at the end of the table because his position in the ship's social hierarchy placed him there. And he did not mind, because the end of the table was closest to the viewport, and the viewport showed the Morinthi corridor. 200 light-years of ancient silence, and silence was something Callum had learned to read the way other linguists read text. Lieutenant Pell, the ship's communications officer, was the only crew member who sought out Callum's company voluntarily. Pell was 26, Thessaly IV born like Callum, with the kind of quiet curiosity that made good signals officers and better listeners. She had once asked Callum, during a meal they shared in the otherwise empty mess at 200 ship time, what it felt like to study a dead language. He had told her it felt like reading a letter from someone who had died before you were born, and knowing that the letter was addressed to you. She had not asked follow-up questions. She had nodded and gone back to her meal, and Callum had appreciated both the question and the silence that followed it. He was reviewing the dead language files when the first anomaly hit. The dead language, formerly catalogued as Arthon-7 in the Terran Linguistic Archive, was the reason Callum was aboard the Ashenvale instead of back on Thessaly, IV, teaching graduate seminars on xenolinguistic field methodology. Arthon-7 was a reconstructed language, assembled over 60 years from archaeological fragments found on 17 dead worlds scattered across a 200 light-year corridor that the old star charts called the Morinthi Corridor. The worlds had been dead for at least 11,000 years. Whatever civilization had built the cities whose ruins still marked those planets had vanished so completely that even their name was a scholarly invention, the Arthon, from the root word Arthon found on a basalt obelisk on the seventh world surveyed, which the reconstruction team had tentatively glossed as the ones who calculated or the ones who resolved. The Arthon had been, by every material indicator, a civilization of extraordinary technological sophistication. Their architectural remains showed structural engineering that exceeded anything in the current galactic record. Their metallurgical residues contained alloys that Terran material science could not replicate. And their language, the fragments of it that survived on stone, on metal, on the vitrified walls of buildings that had withstood 11 millennia of erosion, was the densest, most informationally compact communication system ever documented. Callum had spent 7 years reconstructing Arthon-7, 7 years of basalt rubbings and spectrographic analysis, and late nights in a university lab on Thessaly IV, staring at fragments of syllabary carved into walls that had stood for 100 centuries, while the species that raised them crumbled to dust around them. He had a working vocabulary of 900 words, a partial grammar, and a growing conviction that the language had been designed rather than evolved. Natural languages carried redundancy, repetition, ambiguity, multiple paths to the same meaning, because they developed organically through generations of imprecise usage. Arthon-7 had no redundancy. Every phoneme carried exactly one semantic load. Every syntactic rule was exceptionless. The language operated with the precision of mathematics and the expressiveness of music, and Callum had never encountered anything like it in any living language anywhere in the galaxy. Which was why he was aboard a destroyer instead of a university. 6 weeks ago, a deep space monitoring station at the trailing edge of the Morinthi Corridor had detected an electromagnetic emission from inside the corridor's dead zone, a region where no emissions had been detected in the entire history of Terran exploration. The emission was brief, structured, and when the monitoring station's linguistic AI ran it through the Terran archive, it returned a partial match. Arthon-7, a dead language spoken by a dead civilization, transmitted from dead space. The monitoring station had flagged it as a first contact event and routed it to Fleet Command. Fleet Command had dispatched the Ashenvale, a warship, because Fleet Command's institutional memory included 11 first contact scenarios that had turned violent, and only 3 that hadn't, and they had pulled Callum from his sabbatical on Thessaly IV, because he was the only human alive who could read Arthon-7 with any fluency. The anomaly arrived at 3:47 ship time. Callum's console, a dedicated linguistic analysis terminal wired into the Ashenvale's passive sensor array, registered an electromagnetic pulse from bearing 037, range indeterminate, duration 1.7 seconds. The pulse carried structured content. Callum's analysis software broke it down in real time. Phonemic structure consistent with Arthon-7, grammatical markers matching his reconstructed syntax templates, and a semantic payload that his software could parse at approximately 40% confidence. He played the audio analog. The sound filled the linguistics annex like a voice in a cathedral, deep, resonant, carrying overtones that his human hearing could barely resolve, but that his instruments measured with precision. The voice spoke 7 words. Callum understood 4 of them. The ones who calculate still, waiting here. He stared at the waveform on his screen. His hands were steady. His breathing was not. "Commander Vasek." He opened the internal comm to the bridge. "This is Linguist Dre in the annex. I have a structured emission on bearing 037. Arthen 7 confirmed at 40% parse confidence. Content indicates a presence, possibly a beacon, possibly a greeting." Commander Etta Vasek ran the Ashenvale the way Callum had learned she ran everything, with the minimum number of words that communicated the maximum amount of authority. Her response came in 3 seconds. "Nature of the presence. Unknown. The transmission uses a construction I have tentatively identified as locative persistent, a grammatical form, indicating that the subject exists at a specific location and has existed there continuously. The closest translation is still here or remaining at this place." "How long is continuously?" Callum looked at the linguistic data. The locative persistent construction in Arthen 7 carried a temporal marker, a suffix that indicated duration. The suffix on this transmission was one he had only seen twice in the archaeological record, both times on monuments that commemorative texts suggested had stood for thousands of years. The suffix meant, as nearly as he could render it, since the beginning of the counting. "I cannot give you a number, Commander, but the grammatical form implies a very long time." "Define very long, linguist." The temporal suffix appears in the archaeological record on 2 structures. Both are dated to the early Arthen period, approximately 11,000 years ago. The suffix encodes duration that predates the speaker's own memory. In human linguistic terms, the closest equivalent would be the English word always, but with a specificity that always lacks. It does not mean I have been here for an indefinite time. It means I have been here for a precisely known amount of time that is so large it has become a feature of my identity. Vasek processed that in silence. Callum heard the bridge's background hum through the open channel, the sound of a warship's nervous system, all of its systems on passive, all of its sensors reaching into the dark. "Tactical, give me a passive scan on bearing 037. Linguist Dre, maintain monitoring. Do not transmit. Bridge out." The Ashenvale shifted. Callum felt it in the deck plating, the subtle vibration change, as the destroyer adjusted its orientation, bringing its passive sensor arrays to bear on the source of the transmission. The rain sound on the hull shifted pitch, and for a moment the linguistics annex was silent. Then the second transmission arrived. This one was longer, 12 seconds of structured speech, dense with information, carrying grammatical markers that Callum had to process manually because his software's 40% confidence dropped to 26 on the more complex constructions. He worked through it phoneme by phoneme, mapping each sound against his vocabulary, marking the gaps where his reconstruction failed, building the sentence like a man assembling a bridge while standing on it. "The ones who calculate, the ones who waited. The door has been closed for a long time. We hear new voices. The door is ready." Callum's throat went tight. He set his coffee down. The bulb cup clicked against the console's utility tray, a small human sound in a room full of alien data, and leaned closer to the waveform display. In 7 years of studying Arthen 7, he had never encountered the word for door in any context other than architectural descriptions. In those contexts, it meant a physical threshold, an entryway, an opening, a passage between chambers. But this usage carried a different suffix, one he had cataloged but never fully understood. The suffix modified the base noun to indicate a door between categories of existence, not a door between rooms, but a door between states of being, a transition, a threshold between what was and what would be. He reported to the bridge. Vasek's response was clipped. The passive scan shows a gravitational anomaly at the estimated source point, mass consistent with a large artificial structure, no energy emissions beyond the linguistic transmissions, no weapons signatures, no drive signatures. It appears to be stationary. It's been stationary for 11,000 years, Commander. A pause. Explain. The civilization that spoke this language has been dead for 11 millennia. Their worlds are ruins. Whatever is transmitting is either a machine they left behind, or it is something else, something that survived. Either way, it has been sitting in the dark, waiting, for longer than human civilization has existed. Vasek processed that. Callum could almost hear the calculation, the tactical assessment, the risk matrix, the chain of command considerations. When she spoke, her voice was unchanged. Linguist Dre, can you communicate with it? I have 900 words and a partial grammar in a language that was dead before humanity discovered fire. I can try. Try. Callum composed his first transmission with the care of a man defusing a bomb. He used the simplest construction in Arthan 7, the declarative present, the grammatical form for stating current facts. He kept to words he was confident about, words he had cross-referenced across multiple archaeological sources and verified through independent attestation. We are here, we are new voices, we hear you. He converted the words to the phonemic structure his reconstruction specified, adjusted the tonal values to match the frequency profile of the incoming transmissions, and sent the message through the Ashenvale's directional communication array on a narrow beam aimed at the source point. The response came in 2.3 seconds, fast, too fast for a pre-programmed beacon cycling through stored messages. This was real-time processing and intelligence hearing his words, parsing them, formulating a response, and transmitting it back in the time it took Callum to exhale. The transmission was 4 words. You speak correctly, come. Callum sat in his chair and felt the full weight of those 4 words settle on him like gravity. The language was precise. The grammar was correct. The word for correctly carried a suffix he had never encountered in the Dead World fragments, a modifier that indicated not merely accuracy but understanding. Not you speak our words, but you speak with comprehension. You are not mimicking. You know what you are saying. Whatever was out there had just evaluated his linguistic competence and found it sufficient. In 4 words and 2.3 seconds. He reported. Vasek ordered the Ashenvale to close on the source point at 1/4 thrust, weapons cold but ready. All departments at Condition 3, the middle state between routine operations and combat stations. The rain sound on the hull deepened as the destroyer's passive arrays reconfigured for close-range monitoring, and Callum sat in his annex with 900 words and a growing awareness that 900 words might be the most important vocabulary any human had ever carried. Pell's voice came through the annex intercom 40 minutes after the course change. She spoke the way she always spoke, quietly, precisely, with the faint Thessany IV vowel shift that Callum could hear like a thumbprint on every syllable. Linguist Dre. I am routing all sensor analog audio directly to your console per Commander Vasek's order. You should also know that the source emission has changed. It is no longer a single frequency pulse. It is cycling through 4 distinct frequency bands at intervals of exactly 3.1 seconds. 4 bands. Affirmative. Each band corresponds to a different spectral range. The cycling pattern is regular, but the content on each band appears to be distinct, as if the source is transmitting 4 separate messages simultaneously. Callum pulled up the frequency analysis. 4 bands, 4 distinct streams of structured content. He ran each one through his Arthan 7 parser independently and got 4 different outputs, 4 sentences, transmitted in parallel, each one using a different register of the language. He had identified 3 registers in his archaeological work: declarative, relational, and temporal. The 4th band used a register he had never documented. The first 3 streams said, "We have been calculating. The calculation continues. The calculation requires new data." The 4th stream, the unknown register, said something he could not fully parse, but the emotional weight of it, the placement of emphasis, The way the phonemes clustered around a central concept told him its approximate shape. It was not a statement. It was not a question. It was closer to an invitation. He sat with that for 5 minutes, parsing and reparsing, before he trusted his analysis enough to report it. In those 5 minutes, the Ashenvale covered 1,200 kilometers, and the gravitational anomaly ahead of them grew 0.3% stronger on the passive sensors, and Callum felt the ship's subtle vibration change in ways that told him the engineering department was adjusting the inertial dampeners for an object with more mass than they had initially estimated. The approach took 4 hours. During those 4 hours, the entity transmitted 11 more times. Callum worked without pause, without food, without standing, his body locked into the posture of concentration that his ex-wife had called the fossil position, because he looked like something that had been sitting in the same chair for geological time. His coffee grew cold in the bulb cup mounted on the console's utility arm. His neck ached. His eyes burned. He did not notice any of it. Each transmission was longer, more complex, and more linguistically sophisticated than the last. Callum worked through them with increasing speed as his pattern recognition adapted to the entity's dialect, because it was a dialect, a variant of Arthan 7 that differed from the archaeological reconstruction in ways that suggested it had continued to develop after the fragments on the dead worlds had been carved. The language had not fossilized. It had evolved. Alone in the dark for 11,000 years, whatever spoke it had kept speaking, kept refining, kept thinking in a language that had no other speakers. The implications of that made Callum's hands shake, and he pressed them flat against his console and kept working. Transmission 3 contained a test. Callum recognized it because he had designed similar tests himself. In his academic work, diagnostic transmissions crafted to evaluate a listener's comprehension level. The entity sent a sentence using a syntactic structure that could be parsed 2 ways, depending on whether the listener understood a particular grammatical suffix. The correct parsing yielded a meaningful statement. The incorrect parsing yielded nonsense. It was the equivalent of asking someone to pronounce a word that only a native speaker could get right, a shibboleth, a gate, a way of measuring whether the person on the other end of the line could truly read the language or was simply pattern matching. Callum parsed it correctly. He knew because the entity's next transmission, transmission 4, shifted registers in a way that indicated confidence. It was no longer testing. It was teaching. Transmission 4 introduced a concept he had not encountered in any Arthan 7 source, a grammatical mood for shared understanding, not declarative stating a fact, and not interrogative asking a question, and not imperative issuing a command, but something else, a mood that indicated the speaker was constructing meaning together with the listener, a collaborative tense, a grammar for thinking out loud with another mind. Callum had never seen it in any language. He had theorized about it in a paper he'd published 6 years ago, a hypothetical grammatical structure for a species that prioritized collective cognition over individual assertion. The peer reviewers had called it interesting but speculative. Now it was being spoken to him by something that had waited 11,000 years for someone to speak back. Transmission 5 was a mathematical interlude, a sequence of prime numbers, Fibonacci ratios, and geometric proofs transmitted in the pure logic register that Callum had identified in archaeological contexts as the Arthan equivalent of showing your work. The entity was demonstrating that it could think in structures that transcended language, that its cognition operated on levels where words were unnecessary. Callum recognized the gesture for what it was, a display of capability, calibrated not as intimidation but as introduction. The mathematical equivalent of "here is what I can do," offered with the same measured care that characterized every other aspect of the entity's communication. Transmission 6 introduced temporal concepts that Callum had spent 2 years of his reconstruction attempting to decode from fragmentary archaeological evidence. In 4 seconds of structured speech, The entity resolved ambiguities that had generated 3 competing academic papers and a conference session that had ended in a shouting match between Callum and a colleague from the University of Mars. The colleague had been wrong. Callum had been wrong. The truth was stranger than either of them had proposed, and hearing it spoken aloud casually, as if it were obvious, was the first moment in the conversation where Callum felt the full scale of what he was dealing with. Not the scale of the entity's intelligence, which he had grasped from the first transmission. The scale of his own ignorance. 7 years of reconstruction, 900 words of vocabulary, and he had been working with a child's crayon drawing of a masterwork oil painting. Transmission 7 contained a word that broke Callum's reconstruction framework entirely. The word was a compound 3 root morphemes joined by a connective suffix that indicated conceptual integration. The first root was arthen, the ones who calculate. The second was a root Callum had tentatively glossed as pattern or structure. The third was a root he did not know, had never seen, could not parse. But its position in the sentence and its relationship to the other roots gave him enough context to attempt meaning. The compound word meant, as nearly as he could render it, the ones who calculate the patterns of what is real. Callum stared at that translation for a long time. Then he opened the comm. Commander, the entity is using vocabulary and grammar that goes beyond anything in the archaeological record. It is not simply a machine replaying stored messages. It is generating original language in real time, using constructions that imply active cognition. I believe we are communicating with a sapient intelligence. Vasic, one of the Arthen. I don't know what it is, but it speaks their language, it thinks in their language, and it has been alone with that language for 11,000 years. During the 3rd hour of approach, the Ashenvale's weapons officer, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Lieutenant Commander Soria Akafer, appeared at the door of the linguistics annex. She did not enter. The annex was Callum's designated workspace, and military protocol respected the boundary, but she stood in the doorway and watched him work for 30 seconds before speaking. Linguist Dre, I need a threat assessment. Callum did not look up from his console. I am a linguist, Commander. Threat assessment is outside my competence. The entity is communicating with you. It is responding to your transmissions in real time. It has demonstrated awareness of our position, our course, and our sensor configuration. From a tactical perspective, those are the actions of an intelligence that is tracking us. I need to know whether tracking us is a preamble to something hostile. Callum stopped working. He turned to face her. Akafer's expression was the expression of every military officer he had ever worked with when confronted with a variable their training did not cover. Controlled, professional, and running calculations behind her eyes that had nothing to do with language. Commander, the entity's linguistic register is what I would call pedagogical. It is structuring its transmissions to teach me. Each message builds on the previous one, expanding vocabulary, introducing new grammatical forms, increasing complexity at a rate calibrated to my demonstrated comprehension speed. In 19 years of linguistic fieldwork, I have never encountered a hostile intelligence that opened communications by teaching me its language. Predators do not introduce themselves by showing you how to read their facial expressions. Akafer held his gaze for 3 seconds, then she nodded once and left. Callum turned back to his console, and his hands were not entirely steady, because the truth was more complicated than his answer. The entity was not hostile. He was certain of that. But the entity was also not anything he had a category for. Its transmissions carried an intelligence so vast that his software could not fully map its grammatical complexity. And the implications of that, the sheer cognitive scale, implied by a language that operated at 63 phonemic events per second, across 4 simultaneous registers, were not threatening in the way a weapon was threatening, but they were humbling in a way that Callum felt in his bones. The Ashenvale's visual sensors resolved the structure at a range of 2,000 kilometers. The bridge piped the feed to every department, and Callum watched on his annex display as the darkness ahead of them acquired shape. It was not a ship, it was not a station, it was a structure geometric, angular, vast. A lattice of interlocking crystalline forms, each face perfectly flat, each edge perfectly straight, the whole assembly spanning roughly 8 kilometers along its longest axis. It did not reflect light. It absorbed it, the way the dead worlds of the Arthen absorbed the attention of anyone who walked their empty streets completely, without remainder. The structure was dark, matte, and utterly still, and yet the passive sensors registered thermal output consistent with active internal processes, and the gravitational signature indicated a mass distribution that could only be artificial. It looked like something that had been thought into existence rather than built, a mathematical proof rendered in physical form, a theorem made of crystal and silence. Callum stared at it for a full minute without breathing. He had seen the Arthen ruins on 7 of the 17 dead worlds. He had walked through their empty cities, stood in their abandoned halls, run his fingers over the inscriptions they had left on their walls. Those ruins were impressive. They were grand. They were the remains of a civilization that had been, by any metric, remarkable. This was different. The ruins were the body the Arthen had left behind. This structure was the mind they had become. And the difference in sophistication was the difference between a child's drawing and the Sistine Chapel, not one of kind, but of such magnitude that the comparison itself felt inadequate. The bridge was silent for 11 seconds after the visual feed stabilized. Callum counted. He was counting everything now, because counting was a form of linguistic analysis, and linguistic analysis was the only tool he had. And the tool was all that stood between this moment and the panic that would follow if anyone aboard the Ashenvale allowed themselves to fully comprehend what they were looking at. No weapons signatures, the tactical officer reported. No defensive systems I can identify. No energy shielding. Hull composition reads as a crystalline matrix similar to materials found in Arthen archaeological sites, but significantly more refined. The structure is not emitting any energy except the linguistic transmissions aimed at us. It's a library, Callum said. He did not know why he said it. The word came before the analysis, rising from the same instinct that let him hear grammar in the pattern of rain on a hull. Or a mind, or both. Transmission 9 arrived as the Ashenvale closed to 500 kilometers. This one was the longest yet 43 seconds of densely structured speech that pushed Callum's parsing ability to its limit. He worked through it in near silence, his annex dark except for the glow of his console, the rain sound gone now because the passive arrays had shifted to focused monitoring, and the ambient noise had flattened to a hum. The transmission told him what the structure was. The Arthen had not died, not exactly. 11,000 years ago, at the apex of their civilization, they had faced a choice. Their biological forms were failing not through disease or war, but through the natural entropy of organic existence, the slow degradation that came with being made of cells that divided and erred and aged. They had computed the remaining span of their biological viability and found it insufficient for the work they intended to do, which was, and here Callum's translation became tentative, reaching for meaning across a gulf of conceptual distance to calculate the complete structure of reality. Not to observe it, not to measure it, to understand it in the way that a mind understands a sentence, as a whole that could be parsed into components but whose meaning existed only in the integration. They had concluded that organic cognition, however refined, could not sustain the calculation. The work required continuity, unbroken thought across millennia, across geological time, across the kind of duration that organic minds could not bridge because organic minds forgot and died and had to start over. So they had transferred themselves, Not uploaded. The word in Arthen 7 was more specific than that. They had translated themselves. The same root as the word for language, the same conceptual framework. They had taken the patterns that constituted their minds and expressed them in a more durable medium, the way a thought expressed in sound could be expressed in writing and preserved beyond the lifespan of the voice that spoke it. The crystalline structure ahead of the ashen veil was not a building. It was a mind, a civilization's worth of consciousness, translated from flesh into crystal, still thinking, still calculating, still working on the problem they had set themselves 11,000 years ago. And still waiting, because the calculation, the work, the great project of understanding the complete structure of reality had produced an intermediate result that the Arthen had not anticipated. Somewhere in the depths of their 11,000-year computation, they had encountered other patterns, other structures. Other minds, not Arthen minds, not crystal minds, but the faint, scattered, chaotic electromagnetic signatures of biological intelligences broadcasting into the void without knowing they were being heard. New voices, that was the phrase. New voices in the dark, speaking languages that were rough and redundant and imprecise, and alive in ways that the Arthen's perfected tongue was not. Languages that carried ambiguity, that held multiple meanings in a single word, that evolved and mutated and broke their own rules because the minds that spoke them were messy, organic, mortal, and free. The Arthen had heard those voices and recognized something in them that their own perfected cognition had lost. They could not name it in their language. The word did not exist in Arthen 7, because their language had no room for concepts that could not be precisely defined. But Callum, listening to the transmission, hearing the gap where the word should have been, felt the shape of the absence and knew what it was. Surprise, wonder, the capacity to encounter something genuinely new and not know immediately and completely what it meant. The Arthen had translated themselves into perfect cognition, and in doing so they had lost the ability to be surprised. Their crystal minds processed input with absolute precision, but precision had a cost. Nothing was ever unexpected. Nothing was ever mysterious. Nothing was ever new. Until the new voices came. Callum reported to the bridge. His voice was not steady, and he did not try to make it so. Commander, the entity is a preserved civilization. The Arthen transferred their consciousness into this structure 11,000 years ago to pursue a computational project of extraordinary scope. They have been listening to our transmissions, all galactic transmissions, for centuries. They are not hostile. They are. He paused, searching for the word, aware that words were all he had, and that these words would determine what happened next. They are lonely. They heard us, and they waited for someone who could speak their language, and now they want to talk. Vasik's response came after 7 seconds, the longest pause Callum had heard from her. What do they want to talk about? Callum looked at the translation on his screen. The last phrase of transmission 9, the one he had been turning over in his mind since he parsed it, the one that made his chest ache with something he could not name. They want to understand why our languages are imprecise. They want to know why we built communication systems that allow misunderstanding. They have been computing the structure of reality for 11,000 years, and the one thing their computation cannot account for is why biological minds, human minds, alien minds, any organic intelligence would deliberately choose to speak in ways that permit ambiguity. They think ambiguity might be the variable they are missing, the piece their calculation cannot solve. He heard Vasik breathe, once, twice. They are asking us to explain being imprecise. They are asking us to explain being alive, Commander. In the only terms they have left, the terms of language, the terms of grammar, the terms of how you build a sentence that means more than one thing at the same time. They translated themselves into perfect thought, and they discovered that perfect thought cannot think certain things. They need us. They need the mess. The comm went silent. Then, Condition 3 stands, close to 100 kilometers. Linguist Dre, prepare for extended communication. I am logging this as a first contact event under Treaty Protocol 7. Commander, Treaty Protocol 7 authorizes weapons deployment. I am aware. It also authorizes extended first contact linguistic engagement, which is what you are about to conduct. The weapons are for the Admiral's comfort, linguist Dre, not for mine. Callum prepared his next transmission, and for the first time in the conversation, he did not compose it in R-7. He composed it in English. He used English deliberately rough, redundant, ambiguous, alive English, with its irregular verbs and its borrowed words and its maddening capacity to mean three things at once depending on context and inflection, and the look on the speaker's face. He spoke into the recording buffer, and his voice carried the Rainier Noldwood accent of Thessany IV, the colony world cadence that his university colleagues had never managed to fully knock out of him, and he said, "My name is Callum Dre. I study languages. I have been studying yours for 7 years, and I know 900 of your words, and I am here because you spoke and I could hear you. I want to understand you, but I also want you to understand me, and to do that, I need to speak the way I actually think in a language that is full of holes and guesses, and words that change their meaning when you look at them from a different angle. I am going to be imprecise. I am going to be ambiguous. I am going to use words that mean more than one thing, because that is what being alive sounds like. If your calculation is missing a variable, I think I am it." He transmitted, and then he transmitted the R-7 equivalent, a translation that he knew was incomplete, that he knew missed half the nuance of what he had said in English, that he knew was a pale shadow of the living, breathing, imprecise thing he had spoken. He sent both versions because the gap between them, the space where meaning existed in one language, but not the other, was precisely the thing the Arthen wanted to understand. On the bridge, Vasek had ordered the audio feed to the entire ship. Callum did not know this at the time. He learned it later during the committee hearing, when Vasek testified that she had made the decision because her crew needed to hear what was happening in the linguistics annex, not as data, not as a tactical briefing, but as the event itself. She told the committee that she had commanded warships for 6 years, and that the most important command decision she had ever made was routing a linguist's microphone to every speaker on a destroyer. The response took 19 seconds, longer than any previous reply. Callum waited. The annex hummed. The Ashenvale held position. Somewhere behind him, the weapons systems that Treaty Protocol 7 had authorized sat dormant in their housings, cold and unnecessary. When the response came, it arrived in 2 channels simultaneously. One channel carried R-7 perfect, precise, exceptionless R-7, every phoneme carrying exactly one semantic load, the language of a civilization that had spent 11,000 years refining the instrument of its thought. The other channel carried something new. The second channel carried an attempt at English. It was broken. It was wrong. The phonemes were off, the syntax was tangled, the verb tenses collapsed into each other. It was the worst English Callum had ever heard, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever listened to, because it meant that an 11,000-year-old crystalline intelligence had heard his imprecise, ambiguous, hole-filled language, and decided that the appropriate response was not to correct it, not to translate it into something cleaner, but to try it, to take the mess into its own mouth and speak it badly, because speaking badly was the whole point. Speaking badly meant accepting that you did not fully understand. Speaking badly meant admitting that the other mind contained things you could not parse. Speaking badly meant being surprised. The broken English said, "Callum Dre, we, here the holes are, the meaning we did not know." This. Pell's voice came through the intercom, barely above a whisper. "Linguist Dre, I am reading the second channel transmission on the bridge. The entire bridge crew is reading it. Commander Vasek has ordered all departments to monitor the linguistic feed." A pause. "The navigation officer is crying, sir. I thought you should know." Callum did not respond. He was not sure his voice would work. The Ashenvale had gone quiet. Not the quiet of a warship on alert, the quiet of 112 people listening to the same thing and understanding, each in their own way, that the thing they were hearing was unprecedented. The weapons systems remained cold. The tactical board remained green. Somewhere in the engineering section, someone had routed the linguistic feed through the ship's internal speakers, and the broken, clumsy, magnificent English of an 11,000-year-old intelligence filled the corridors of a wedge-class destroyer that had been built to kill things, and the ship held still and listened. Callum pressed his hands flat on the console. The tremor ran through his fingers, up his wrists, into his chest. He breathed the recycled air of the linguistics annex, and he heard the ghost of rain on the hull, and he understood that he was witnessing something that had not happened in 11,000 years, a perfect mind choosing to be imperfect. A civilization that had transcended organic limitation, discovering that organic limitation was itself a form of knowledge. A language that had no word for surprise encountering surprise, and reaching for the only vocabulary that could hold it, a human vocabulary, rough and broken and full of holes, borrowed from a species that had existed for an eye blink compared to the Arthan's long vigil in the dark. He answered in English, because English was what they needed. The holes are the meaning. Yes, that is exactly right. What followed was the longest single communication event in the history of Terran first contact. It lasted 11 hours. Callum spoke. The Arthan spoke. They traded words back and forth across the 100-kilometer gap between a wedge-class destroyer and a crystalline, mind the size of a small city. And with each exchange, the Arthan's English improved and Callum's Arthan 7 deepened. And the space between the two languages, the gap where meaning lived that neither tongue could fully capture, became the subject of the conversation itself. In the second hour, the Arthan asked Callum to explain the English word home. He tried. He said it meant the place where you lived. The Arthan responded in their improving English that this definition was insufficient. Many places could be lived in. What distinguished home from the others? He said it was the place you returned to. The Arthan asked whether every place you returned to was home. Callum said no. And the Arthan asked what the additional variable was, and Callum said feeling. And the Arthan went silent for 11 seconds, which was, by that point, the longest silence in their conversation. When they responded, they used a new grammatical construction, one they had invented on the spot, breaking 3 of their own syntactic rules to build it. The construction encoded a location plus emotion plus continuity, a single compound form that meant the place that feels like returning even when you have never left. It was not the English word home. It was something adjacent to it, something that overlapped with it without being identical, and the overlap was the point. The Arthan were building new language to describe the space between their understanding and his, and every new word they built was itself an act of imprecision, a reach toward meaning that could not be precisely grasped. In the 4th hour, Callum asked the Arthan a question he had been holding since Transmission 9. He asked it in Arthan 7, using the interrogative mood, the only grammatical form that Arthan 7 permitted for questions. Do you regret translating yourselves? The response came in 14 seconds. It came in Arthan 7, and it used the declarative mood, which meant the answer was a statement of fact rather than an opinion. We do not have the cognitive architecture for regret. Regret requires the ability to imagine an alternative past and assign it greater value than the actual past. Our cognition evaluates only the actual. We cannot imagine alternatives that did not occur. Then a pause of 6 seconds, and a second transmission, this one in English, broken and careful. But we think we should be able to regret. We think regret is part of what we are missing. The Arthan explained their computation. Not in mathematical terms, Callum was a linguist, not a physicist, but in linguistic terms, because they had discovered that the structure of a language was itself a theory of reality. Every grammar was a map of what a mind considered real. The Arthan grammar, with its precision and its exceptionless rules, was a map of a universe that could be fully described. But the universe, they had discovered after 11,000 years of calculation, could not be fully described. There were phenomena, not quantum uncertainty, not chaos theory, but something deeper, something structural in the fabric of reality that resisted precise description, because they existed only in the space between descriptions. The way a poem means something that its words do not literally say. The way a melody carries emotion that the notes do not contain. The way a silence between two people can mean I love you, or I am afraid, or I don't know what to say. And the meaning lives not in the silence itself, but in the relationship between the people, which cannot be reduced to information. The Arthan had been trying to compute that relationship for 11,000 years, and they had failed, because their language could not hold it. Their perfect grammar could describe the silence but could not inhabit it. Their exceptionless syntax could model the space between meanings, but could not be the space between meanings. They needed a language that was imprecise, a language that broke its own rules, a language that carried ambiguity as a feature rather than a flaw, because ambiguity was the cognitive mechanism that biological minds use to navigate the unresolvable space between descriptions. They needed a translator, not to translate their language into another language, but to translate their understanding into a form that could hold what understanding could not contain. In the 6th hour, Akafur appeared at the annex door again. This time she did not ask about threat assessment. She stood in the doorway for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quality Callum had never heard from her before, something that was not professional, not tactical, not the product of training. Something human. The engineering team has been monitoring the crystalline structure's thermal signature, she said. It fluctuates. The fluctuation pattern matches the cadence of the linguistic transmissions. When the entity speaks, its temperature rises by 0.4 degrees Kelvin. When it listens, the temperature drops. The chief engineer says the thermal behavior is consistent with metabolic activity, with thought generating heat the way a brain generates heat. The structure is not just processing information, linguist Dre, it is thinking, and thinking costs it energy. Speaking to you is costing it something. She paused. I wanted you to know that. Callum looked at her. Thank you, Commander. She nodded and left, and Callum turned back to his console and felt the weight of what she had told him. The Arthan's conversation with him was not effortless. It was an expenditure. Every response, every broken English sentence, every new word they invented to bridge the gap between their cognition and his, cost them energy in the most literal physical sense. They were spending themselves on this exchange. They were choosing to spend themselves, the way a human chooses to stay up all night talking to someone they have just met, because the conversation matters more than the cost. Callum told them about Thessaly IV, about the rain that smelled like iron and old wood, about the way his mother's voice sounded when she sang the evening hymn in the kitchen, the melody slightly flat because she sang from memory and memory was imprecise, and the flatness was part of the beauty because it meant the song had been lived in, worn smooth by a real voice in a real room on a real evening. He told them about learning his first alien language Veshan trade cant, with its 17 words for obligation and no word for forgiveness, and how the absence of a word had taught him more about the Veshan than the presence of all the other words combined. He told them about his ex-wife, about the argument where he had said he dreamed in grammatical structures, and how she had been right that this explained something important, something he had only understood years later, that he had been so focused on the structure of what people said that he had missed the meaning of what they felt, and the meaning of what they felt could not be parsed into grammar because it existed in the wholes. He told them about the day his daughter was born, about the sound she made. The first sound, which was not a word and not a cry, and not any category of vocalization he had a label for, but which meant, in a register that bypassed language entirely, "I am here and I need you." And how he had heard that sound and understood for the first time in his professional life that the most important communication he would ever participate in had no grammar at all. He told them about loss, about his father's death, which had happened while Callum was on field work in the Garin border zone, 3 weeks out of communication range. He had received the news by recorded message, his mother's voice, steady, precise, carrying the information in the fewest possible words, and the steadiness of her voice had told him more than any words could have, because the steadiness was a performance, a control exerted over grief that was too large to express, and the performance was itself the expression. His mother's calm was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He had played the message once and understood everything, and he had never played it again, because some messages only needed to be heard once to change you permanently. The Arthan listened. Callum felt the listening the way a speaker feels an audience, not through any measurable signal, but through the quality of the silence between his words and their responses. A silence that was not empty but attentive, a silence that leaned forward. He had felt that quality of attention once before in his career, during a negotiation session with the Cathari, when a senior negotiator had listened to Callum's translation of a contested trade clause with such intensity that the air between them had seemed to thicken with the weight of comprehension. The Arthan's attention was like that, but amplified to a degree that made the comparison feel trivial. Their responses grew longer, more complex, and for the first time in 11,000 years less precise. They began using words incorrectly, not by error, by choice. They began reaching for meanings that their vocabulary could not hold, stretching their perfect language past its designed limits, inventing new constructions that broke their own syntactic rules, because the things they were trying to say could not be said within those rules. They were learning to be imprecise. And Callum, sitting in a dark annex aboard a Wedge-class destroyer in the middle of the deadest stretch of space humanity had ever charted, listening, translating, speaking back, felt the awe settle into him like weather. Not the awe of encountering something vast and powerful, though the Arthan were that. Not the awe of witnessing an intelligence that dwarfed his own, though it did, by a margin he could not comprehend. But the awe of watching something perfect choose to be imperfect, and knowing that the choice was made because of him, because of the holes in his language, because of the gaps in his understanding, because a 41-year-old field linguist from a colony world, standing in a dark annex on a warship, carrying 900 words in a dead language, had offered the one thing that 11,000 years of computation could not produce, the sound of a mind that did not know the answer. In the 7th hour, Callum asked the Arthan whether they missed their bodies. The question was imprecise deliberately, because precision was what they were learning to move past. He asked it in English first, then in Arthan 7, and the gap between the two versions was, as always, the most important part of the message. The English carried an emotional weight that the Arthan 7 could not replicate. The word miss in English meant both the absence of something desired and the failure to connect, to miss a target, to miss a chance, to miss a person, and all of those meanings existed simultaneously in the question, and the simultaneous existence was the point. The response took 23 seconds. When it arrived, it was in English only. No Arthan 7 counterpart. The first time the entity had chosen English over its own language. We do not miss, we compute the absence, we know the shape of what is gone, but knowing the shape is not the same as feeling. The emptiness, we know this now, because of you, you feel emptiness, and the feeling is different from knowing the shape. The feeling is more. Callum sat with those words for a long time. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the linguist in him noted that the entity had just used the English word more in a context that transcended quantity, not more as in greater amount, but more as in richer, deeper, containing dimensions that measurement could not capture. It was using the ambiguity of English as a tool, the way Callum used the precision of Arthen 7 as a tool. They were teaching each other their own language's strengths. At hour 7, the Ashenvale's tactical officer detected an energy surge from the crystalline structure. Weapons systems spun up across the destroyer's hull. Callum heard the alert klaxon and ignored it because the surge was not a weapon. He knew what it was before the sensors confirmed it. The structure was opening. The same way the Dead World buildings opened in the archaeological hollows, geometric sections separating along precise lines, the crystalline lattice unfolding like a proof reaching its conclusion. And from inside light, not the light of weapons or engines, but ambient light, warm and diffuse, the color of honey, filling the interior of the unfolded structure like dawn filling a valley. The visual feed showed the interior. Callum looked at it and understood why the Arthen had no word for surprise. Inside the structure, in the honey-colored light, suspended in a crystalline matrix that held them the way a sentence holds its words, were the Arthen, not their minds, their bodies, thousands of them preserved in crystal, each one a physical form that had been carefully, lovingly maintained for 11,000 years by the intelligence that had once inhabited it. They were tall, angular, with faces that carried an expression Callum did not need to translate. The expression of someone who had set something down with the intention of picking it back up, someday, when the work was done. But the work was not done. The calculation was incomplete. And the Arthen were showing Callum their bodies the way a scholar shows a colleague the text that started everything, not as a threat, not as a display of power, but as context, as an origin, as the thing they had been before they became what they were, the thing they had left behind because they thought precision mattered more than anything. And now they were not sure. Pell appeared in the annex doorway. She had been off shift for 4 hours, but she was fully dressed, her face pale with exhaustion, and something else, the expression of someone who had been listening to a conversation that had rearranged the furniture of her understanding. "Linguist Dre," she said, "the bridge has been routing the entire conversation to Fleet Command in real time. Admiral Thesson has been monitoring for the last 3 hours. He wants you to ask the entity about its defensive capabilities." Callum looked at her. She looked back. Her expression said what her words did not. "I am telling you this because I have to. What you do with it is your decision. Tell Admiral Thesson that I am a linguist, not an intelligence officer, and that the conversation is proceeding along lines that the entity has established, and that diverting it to extract tactical information would compromise the first contact protocol I am operating under." Pell nodded. "I will relay that, sir." She paused. For what it's worth, Commander Vasek already told him the same thing. The Admiral's response was noted. She left. Callum turned back to his console and transmitted the next exchange, and he did not ask about defensive capabilities, and the conversation continued. "Callum Dre," the next transmission said, and it came in English, broken but clear, each word placed with the deliberate care of a mind that was choosing to be clumsy. "We left these. We thought the calculation was worth leaving them. We do not know now if that was correct." Callum's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't know either," he said. And the honesty of that, the irreducible, untranslatable, imprecise honesty of a man admitting that he did not have the answer, was the most useful thing he had ever said. The Arthen's response came in both languages at once. In Arthen 7, it was a perfect sentence, grammatically flawless, carrying exactly one meaning. "We have a new variable to include." In English, it was 3 words, spoken badly, the vowels wrong, the consonants blurred, the syntax absent. "Thank you, friend." In the 8th hour, something changed. The Arthen's transmissions, which had been growing steadily more fluent in English and steadily more experimental in Arthen 7, suddenly stopped. The silence lasted 47 seconds, an eternity by the standards of their conversation, where the longest previous pause had been 19 seconds. Callum waited. The annex hummed. The weapons board remained green. The entire ship held its breath. When the transmission resumed, it came in Arthen 7 only. No English. Pure, perfect, exceptionless Arthen 7, delivered at the language's full natural speed of 63 phonemic events per second, without the slowdown calibration the entity had been applying to accommodate Callum's processing speed. It was speaking to itself. Or rather, it was speaking in a way that was not intended for him, a burst of internal processing that had leaked into the external communication channel, the cognitive equivalent of thinking out loud. Callum's parser caught fragments. The recurring word Arthen, the word for calculation, a word he had seen in the archaeological record in only one context, on memorial stones, on monuments to the dead. The word meant cessation or ending, or the moment after the last sound. Then the speed dropped. The transmission shifted back to the calibrated rate, and the entity spoke in English. Callum Dre, we have been calculating for 11,000 of your years. The calculation was meant to resolve everything to find the final structure, the pattern that contains all patterns. A pause, 3 seconds. We found it 1,400 years ago. Another pause, 7 seconds, the longest pause in their conversation. The final structure, the pattern of all patterns, is incomplete. It has a hole, a space, where something should be, and the space is the shape of everything we removed from ourselves when we left our bodies behind. Callum sat very still. The calculation is correct. The answer is that the answer cannot be complete without the thing. We discarded the imprecision, the ambiguity, the capacity to not know, to wonder, to feel something without being able to name it. The entity paused again. When it continued, the broken English carried a weight that Callum felt in his sternum. We solved reality, and the solution says we are missing a piece, and the piece is what it feels like to be alive. Callum leaned back in his chair. The annex felt very small. The ship felt very small. Everything he had ever learned about language, about cognition, about the relationship between the words a mind used and the reality it could perceive, felt very small. And the feeling, the raw, physical, inarticulate feeling of being a small, imprecise, mortal thing, in the presence of something vast and ancient, that needed exactly what he was settled into him like water into soil. At hour 9, the Ashenvale received a priority transmission from Fleet Command. 2 additional warships had been dispatched to the Morenthi corridor. An Admiralty Review Board had been convened. A diplomatic delegation was being assembled. The machinery of institutional response was grinding into motion, because that was what institutions did when something happened that exceeded their existing categories. Vasek told Callum he would be replaced by a diplomatic team within 72 hours. The Admiralty wanted formal protocols. The diplomatic corps wanted trained negotiators. The scientific establishment wanted a team of linguists, physicists, cognitive scientists, and xenopsychologists with equipment that the Ashenvale's cramped linguistics annex could not house. Callum nodded. He had expected it. He was a field linguist, not a diplomat. The conversation he had started would be continued by people with more authority, more resources, more institutional backing. They would bring better equipment, larger teams, formal protocols. They would do the work properly. But they would not be imprecise. They would not speak with holes in their sentences. They would not offer the sound of a mind that did not know the answer, because diplomats were trained to sound like they always knew the answer. And that sound, that polished, precise, authoritative sound, was exactly the sound the Arthen did not need. Callum said this to Vasek. Vasek looked at him for a long time, her face lit by the bridge displays, her expression carrying the particular weight of a military commander who understood that the most important thing happening on her ship was not a military event. "I will include your assessment in my report," she said, "and I will recommend that any diplomatic team include you as senior linguistic advisor." "That's not. Linguist Dre, you have been talking to an 11,000-year-old intelligence for 9 hours. It asked for you by name. I have commanded this ship for 6 years, and nothing in my career has prepared me for what I have watched you do tonight. You will be on that diplomatic team, because I will make it so, and if the Admiralty objects, I will remind them that you are the only human being in history who has made a god say thank you." Callum did not know what to say to that, which was, he thought, appropriate. He sat in his annex and looked at the console that had been his workstation for 14 months and his bridge to another form of existence for 11 hours. The coffee in the bulb cup was still cold. His neck still ached. His hands had stopped trembling at some point during the 4th hour and had not started again, because the trembling had been replaced by something deeper, a stillness that was not calm, but was its own kind of understanding. The understanding that he was small, that his language was small, that his 19 years of professional experience and his 900 words of reconstructed vocabulary and his entire career's worth of skill and training were, measured against the intelligence he had been speaking to, approximately as significant as a candle measured against a star, and that the candle was what the star needed, because the star had forgotten what it felt like to flicker. In the 11th hour, the Arthen transmitted one final message. It came in Arthen 7 only, the perfect, precise, exceptionless language of a civilization that had spent 11,000 years refining the instrument of its thought. But the message contained a new word, a word that had not existed in Arthen 7 before that night, a word that the Arthen had invented, constructed from roots and suffixes that their language had never combined, because their language had never needed to describe what the word described. The word was a compound. The first root was Arthen, the ones who calculate. The second root was the one Callum had encountered in Transmission 7, the unknown root that he had been unable to parse. And now, in context, with 11 hours of conversation behind him, with the taste of Raynier Noldwood still in his memory and the weight of everything he had learned pressing on his chest, he understood it. The unknown root meant the ones who do not calculate, the ones who feel, the ones who live in the holes between the words. The compound word Arthen joined to its opposite by the connective suffix that indicated conceptual integration meant the ones who calculate the patterns of what is real, together with the ones who feel the things that patterns cannot hold. It was their word for first contact. And it was, Callum realized with a humility that went all the way down to the oldest part of his mind, a word that could only exist because two languages had met, and neither one was sufficient alone. He sat in the linguistics annex of the TCS Ashenvale, a wedge-class destroyer running dark in the Morenthi corridor, and he listened to the silence between the stars. It did not sound like rain anymore. It sounded like a conversation that had been waiting 11,000 years to begin, and had finally, imprecisely, beautifully, started. He told the committee all of this later. They sat in a conference room on Earth, in a building that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet, and they listened. Admiral Thesson asked about the Arthen's defensive capabilities. Callum told him the truth. The entity had demonstrated no defensive capabilities because it had no need for them. A mind that had solved the fundamental structure of reality did not need weapons any more than a mathematician needed a sword to prove a theorem. The Admiral was not satisfied with this answer. Callum was not surprised. The diplomatic corps representative asked whether the Arthen could be negotiated with, whether they had interests that could be leveraged, resources that could be traded, vulnerabilities that could be identified. Callum told her that the Arthen's only stated interest was in understanding the cognitive experiences that their translation into crystalline form had cost them, and that the only resource they wanted was conversation, and that their only vulnerability was loneliness. She wrote that down in her notes. Callum watched her write it and wondered whether the word loneliness, transcribed in the diplomatic corps representative's neat handwriting on an institutional notepad in a conference room on Earth, carried even a fraction of the meaning it had carried when it was spoken by a mind that had been alone for 11,000 years. Some of the committee understood. The ones who didn't understand asked for the censor data instead, and Callum gave it to them, and he did not resent the asking, because needing data was just another way of needing language, and language was the only bridge he knew. The Arthen were still there. The crystalline structure hung in the Merenthi corridor, 8 kilometers of thought and memory and 11,000 years of patient computation, its thermal signature fluctuating gently with the rhythm of cognition that cost energy and chose to spend it anyway. The diplomatic team was en route. The conversation would continue larger, more formal, more institutional, and Callum hoped, still imprecise enough to matter. Pell found him in the corridor outside the linguistics annex, 20 minutes after the committee session ended. She was holding 2 bulb cups of coffee, and she handed him one without speaking, and they stood in the corridor of the TCS Ashenvale and drank coffee that was too hot and too bitter and exactly right. "Linguist Dre," she said, after a silence that lasted the time it took to drink half a cup, "I have a question." "Ask." "The word the Arthen invented, the compound, the one that means first contact but also means the ones who calculate and the ones who feel together, is that word in Arthen 7? Callum thought about it. It uses Arthen 7 roots and Arthen 7 morphology, but it breaks Arthen 7 syntax rules to exist. It is a word that their language was not designed to produce. They had to damage their own grammar to say it. Pell nodded slowly. So it is not an Arthen 7 word, and it is not an English word. It is something new, something that could only exist because both languages met. "Yes." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. Her Thessany IV vowels rounded the edges of her next sentence in a way that made it sound, to Callum's linguist's ear, like a truth that had been waiting to be spoken. Then the word is the first contact, not the event, the word itself. The word is what happened. Callum looked at her for a long time, and then he smiled, and the smile was imprecise, and the imprecision was the point. He went back to his quarters, and he listened to the rain on the hull, and he did not correct his brain when it heard grammar in the pattern. Some patterns were meant to be found. Some were meant to be felt. The difference between them was the variable the Arthen had been missing, and Callum Dre, field linguist, ex-husband, dreamer in syntax, carrier of 900 words in a dead language, was the only man alive who had stood in the gap between the two and said, "Honestly, I don't know either." It was enough. It was, in the end, the only thing that could have been enough. And the rain kept falling, and the silence kept speaking, and somewhere in a crystalline mind the size of a city, a new word turned slowly in the light, meaning everything that perfect language could not hold.